Hi, this is Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, and you're listening to Briefings Direct. For developers and business architects alike, you often don't know how a technology trend has impacted your company until it's run amok. Just as cloud computing initially seeped into organizations under the cloak of shadow IT, API's use and adoption is often followed an organic, inexact, and unaudited path. You know you're using and benefiting from APIs, internal, via third parties, and many times outwardly exposed. You just don't know where they are, how much they support your services, and how they're being used by just about anyone. Stay with us now as we explore how API-intensive and experienced businesses are bringing maturity to their API's methods and protections. To learn how a poster child for business-critical APIs use, Twitter, makes the most of APIs by better knowing and managing them across their full life cycles, we're joined by several guests to discuss API maturity. We're here with Alyssa Knight, recovering hacker and partner at Knight Inc. Welcome, Alyssa.
Thank you, Dana. I appreciate it.
We're also here with Rinki Sethi, Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer at Twitter. Welcome, Rinki.
Thanks, Dana. Nice to be here.
We're delighted to have you. So we're hearing from security researchers at Akamai and others in their latest State of the Internet report that cyber criminals have noticed APIs and are turning them into an attack vector. This in itself isn't a surprise, but the fact that people might not be prepared for it is. So, Rinki, how is Twitter maturing? What's your philosophy in general about getting the most out of APIs while limiting your risk?
Yeah, I think there's a lot, and I know we're going to go into this a lot deeper, but securing APIs is a multi-layered approach. And, my philosophy on this, APIs are meant to be exposed. We expose APIs to go and enable developers to do amazing things on our platform. But there's a multi-pronged approach, and there's basic tools that help you prevent risk around APIs, whether it's volumetric attacks or the basic vulnerabilities and supporting the infrastructure. But really, each API introduces its own risk, and there's a multi-layered approach in how you go and secure that.
While we're on the subject of, looking into this from the very beginning as a due course of events when you can, tell us a little bit about your beginning. What's your history as a Chief Information Security Officer? And tell us a little bit about your tenure there at Twitter.
Yeah, I've been in the cybersecurity industry for almost 2 decades now. I've been around the block at some really great brands in the Bay Area. I've worked at eBay, Intuit, Palo Alto Networks, IBM. And so been around the block a few times. And I actually took my first CISO role almost 3 years ago at a startup company called Rubrik, Unicorn, and helped them actually after a security breach and help them scale up their security program. And so that was my first role into the CISO. Before that, I had held various roles leading product security, security operations, governance, risk compliance. At Rubrik, it was COVID. We had to scale back a little bit and really focus on just how do we thrive as a business. And at that time, Twitter reached out and I joined Twitter after the security breach and before the US election to really help Twitter build out a scalable security program. So here we are. I'm a little over a year into this role.
Well, great. So the good news about APIs is they're widely exposed and they can be used to a great extent. The bad news is that they're greatly exposed. Knowing that and living with that, I guess, is what you have to get to. But even that being said, what keeps you up at night? What's still a lingering concern when it comes to the use of APIs? And then what can you do to sleep better?
The explosion of APIs has just in the last, I would say, few years, it's just been exponential, right? And our traditional security products that exist, they don't protect us against business logic flaws. And that's what keeps me up at night. Business logic flaws that can land in security or privacy violations for the consumer. And other than unit testing and really looking at your APIs and testing it out for those business logic flaws, and there's not great innovation yet. I think companies are early and there's going to be a lot of good things that come out, but we're still early in that. And I think that's what keeps me up at night. And you kind of have to go back to the manual way of looking at APIs. Otherwise, we have people like Alyssa that come after us and find those issues. And I think that's the biggest challenge we have in front of us.
Hey, Alyssa, you did a white paper recently, The Price of Hubris, the Perils of Overestimating the Security of Your APIs. Other than the business logic that Rinki described, what are the biggest risks in the use almost unmitigated use of APIs these days?
First of all, I think it's more of a library of papers at this point. Like, I feel like every morning Rinky wakes up, she logs into her, oh my God, another paper from Melissa. There's a real, the struggle's real as it relates to API security. And here's the thing, that what was interesting about this paper and what I loved about it was it allowed me for the first time to take all of my vulnerability research across all the industries, automotive, healthcare, financial services, fintech, cryptocurrency exchanges, all these things, and put them into a single paper, a compendium of all of my API exploits and breaches, and to show that this problem is ubiquitous across industries. It's not just a Twitter problem, or it's not just a whatever problem or whatever Acme Bank problem. It's an everyone problem. APIs, much to Rinky's point, APIs have pretty much become the foundation, the plumbing system for everything in our world today. It can affect life and safety. And that's what I think attracts me to it as a vulnerability researcher. It's like George Clooney's movie, if you remember this movie, Peacemaker, where George Clooney was like, I don't care about the terrorist that wants 1,000 nuclear weapons. I care about the terrorist that just wants one. So it's like, I don't care about the hacker that wants to deface websites or steal my data. I care about the hacker that wants to go after my APIs, because that could mean taking remote control of my car that my family is in, or hacking healthcare APIs and stealing my patient records. B of A or Wells Fargo can send you a new debit card in the mail because it was compromised. They can't send you new patient history. So APIs are the foundation, plumbing for everything in our lives today. So I think it's rightfully so attracting a lot of attention by both black hats and white hats.
And why are APIs a different beast? Rinky said that business logic is exposed.
I feel like we as humans tend to gravitate towards what we know. And with APIs, they speak HTTP. So all of the security engineers, I'm sure Rinky has a massive team at Twitter, but the security engineers, I think, immediately go, oh, well, it speaks the HTTP protocol, so let's secure it like a web server. And you can't do that, because when you do that, and Rinky addressed this, is that you're securing it with what I, at this point, would dare to call legacy security with web application firewalls, which is a rules-based language, which is why we have gotten rid of the old snort days, if you remember that, if you're old enough to remember snort. Those days of intrusion detection system signatures, updating antivirus DAT files for every new variant of Code Red Worm that came out. All of these things, we've moved to machine learning, and we've evolved in these other areas. We need to evolve in API security. And we tend to gravitate towards the things we know and secure it like a web server, because to us, we think because it's using the same protocol, it is a web server, and it's not. It's so much more. And the types of attacks that hackers are using, that I use, that are the most prevalent, are like what Rinky said, logic-based attacks. I'm logged in Alyssa, but I'm requesting Rinky's patient records. A WAF isn't going to understand that. A WAF is going to look for things like SQL injection or cross-site scripting, like patterns in the payloads. It's not going to know the difference between who Rinky is and who I am. There's no context in security. And that's what we need to do, is we need to focus more on context and security.
And so Rinky, looking for patterns, using older generations of tools doesn't cut it. There's also something about APIs that there's a machine-needed pattern recognition. This is not something that people can keep up with. So isn't there something also intrinsic about APIs where you need to deploy a bit more than brute labor and manual, interceding into what's going on?
Yeah, 100. And there's a lot of things that you can do from an automation perspective, like things like input, output content validation, looking at patterns and schema and developing rules around that, making sure that you've got some kind of threat detection tooling around it. So there's a lot that you can do. But a lot of times when you're looking at partner APIs and how your APIs are interfacing and so forth, there's still kind of a good human check that needs to happen. Now, there are new products coming out to help with these types of scenarios, but I think, again, it's very early. There's a lot of false positives in them, but there is a lot of tooling that will help you capture, I want to say like 80%, but you still need, I think, some kind of manual look at, actually have a human take a look at and see if things are working. And to add to that, you have this issue of shadow APIs or APIs that are old, and for forgot about them because you no longer are using them. And those can create security risks as well. So it goes beyond just the tooling. There's other components in a full-blown security API security program.
And Alyssa, because we're looking at this not just as a technology solution, there's people, there's a combination of people and technology. It seems to me that there needs to be a certain cultural adaptation to understand the API threat. So how is it that organizations need to think or behave differently when it comes to the life cycle of APIs? They might be developed with nobody considering that they're going to be as exposed as they might be.
Yeah. So the interesting thing here, because, I'm so bored and I'm always trying to find something to do. I'm also the CISO for a bank. And one of the things that, I ran into was really, like you mentioned with culture, sort of this culture shift within DevOps to understand that this isn't a you problem, an issue. What I was running into is developers that are spawning or developing or deploying new APIs and then determining what within the cloud environment they should use to secure it, that's a DevOps concern and that's an IT concern. And because they're looking at it through a DevOps lens. And so what I needed to do was educate them from a culture perspective that yes, you have the ability with your administrative access to deploy new APIs, but it is not your decision on how you secure them. We need to move more towards this mindset of a DevSecOps culture where I get that you want to get these APIs up and running and get it working quickly, but security needs to be a part of that once it's deployed into development, not production, but development, that my team can go in there and hack it and pen test it and secure it properly before it's deployed. Because what's happening is you have these DevOps teams. They're like, look, we need to go, we need to rush, we need to deploy. And they're in there with administrative access to the cloud service provider. So they have the privileges to launch a WAF. And launch, we'll pick on Azure or Amazon, but just launch an API gateway with security features and not understand that it's the wrong tool for the job. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So it is a culture change. It is certainly that. And trying to understand, and historically there's always been, and Rinky can attest to this, historically there's been a very adversarial relationship between security and developers. And it's, to me, part of my job, just taking off my hacker hat and putting on my executive hat as a CISO, is trying to change that mindset that it's not an us versus them equation. We're all on the same team here. It's just security needs to be woven into the software development lifecycle. It needs to shift left and shield right.
Rinky, any thoughts about making the culture of security more amenable to the developers?
Yeah, I think, and I couldn't agree more with what Alyssa said. I mean, it's where I found my passion. It was early on in security. I'm a developer by trade, and being able to relate to developers, you can't just sit there and train them on security and do a one-day training and then expect that things are going to change. It's really got to be, how are you making their lives easier? So to some degree, they don't need to worry about things, and the tooling is training them in the process. And then also, like, that shared sense of responsibility has to be there. And that's not going to come because security says it's important. You've got to show them the impact of a security breach or impact of bugs that are being written in their code and what that can then end with. And that happens by showing them how you hack an application or hack an API and what happens when you're not developing these things in a secure manner. And so bringing that kind of data when it's relevant to them. And I think those are small bits that you can use to change the culture and really drive a cohesive culture with security and the development team where they start becoming champions of security as well.
I agree. And I'll add one more final thought to that. I don't think developers want to write insecure code. And I'm not a developer, so I couldn't speak to that. But I mean, I'm sure nobody wants to do a bad job or wants to be the reason that you end up on the nightly news for a breach. I think developers genuinely want to be better and do better and not do things like hard code usernames and passwords in the mobile app. But I think at the end of the day, it's on the onus of the organization also, where I've spoken to developers and said, hey, look, we get the annual security awareness training that all companies need to take about phishing and stuff like that, but no one sends us to secure code training. Like, how is that not happening? If an organization is writing code, the organization should be sending its developers to separate secure code training. And that needs to happen in addition to the annual security awareness training.
So what I'm hearing, Alyssa, is if you want to have secure APIs, this is something you need to be concerned with across your organization. We talked about developers, we talked about operators a little bit, but in a banking use case like you've described, wouldn't the regulators, wouldn't the risk avoidance and the compliance people also be involved? Are they starting to get mindful of putting in monitoring, auditing what APIs are in use? What's going on with the regulatory part of the house?
I would say, and Rinky, feel free to let me know if I'm wrong, but I feel like risk audit and compliance, like the risk management side of the house, at least in the banking sector, maybe other sectors, don't really get that much into the minutiae, don't really get that much into the weeds about this specific API or regulations around that. I think they're more at a higher level where everything is kind of like more at a business acceptable risk, where I think, and you know, I'm sure Rinky, you've fought these battles. It's like, you know, no matter if you submit 1,000 vulnerabilities to the different parts of the business isn't going to give you a blank check and say, fix them all. It's anything over business acceptable risk is going to get fixed, API or not. And I don't think the risk management group is really going to get that much into the weeds and slice and dice, whether it's APIs or not. I think they're just going to look like they do everything in the business. And that's, if this is above an acceptable risk to the business, then we'll remediate it or treat that risk to an acceptable level, where you're just not going to get rid of risk. It's just always going to be there. And it's just keeping it to an acceptable level. Like we as a bank, we accept the fact that we are going to lose a certain amount of money every year to fraud. There's just nothing we can do about it because fraudsters, hackers, everyone, and much are the same person now these days. We know that they're going to continue to change their tactics and techniques. Like that whole adage, we have to be right all the time. They only have to be right once.
Rinky, do you feel that the risk and compliance folks should be more concerned about APIs, or is this got to fall on the shoulders of the CISO?
I think that a lot of times risk and compliance is under the CISO. And Alyssa said that they don't get into the regulators not going to necessarily get into the minutia and get into the details of each and every API, but they may mandate that you need some kind of security program around that. And as we all know, that's like one aspect of security. But I think starting to come up in discussions, and especially in the banking world, I think they're leading the way as to what others should expect around this. And so what I'm hearing, at least from vendors that are supporting API security, is that it's easier to go to a bank and drive these programs because they already have this culture of having security around that. And I think with other companies, it's starting to come now and it's a little bit more chaotic. And how do we bring all these teams that are involved with APIs together such that we can build good security around it?
One thing I do want to add, Dana, is if you think about it, 20 years ago, back when both Frank and I got into security, it was a different story. It was the motives for hackers was website defacement and getting your name on the Alda's defacement mirror. That was the plan of hacking. Now it's about monetizing the data that you steal. So I would say organizations and really the world writ large is looking at it this way. You don't go digging for gold in just any random hole. You go to a gold, you try and find a gold mine. Data is the same thing. Data is worth more than Bitcoin. So you go to a gold mine to find gold. You go to APIs to find data. Hackers know that if they are going to steal and ransom a company and double dip and then lock and leak, so leak the data and encrypt it, that you go where the gold is, you go where the data is, and that's the APIs. So we're in it right now. I think there's going to be this exodus where hackers are going to start shifting their focus to APIs, knowing that more and more hackers are moving in this direction, knowing that I need to learn JSON. I need to know what the hell that is and not be scared off by it anymore, because that's where the data is. And I need to understand how to hack APIs, because you can't throw a rock and hit a hacker that just because they're a hacker, they know how to hack APIs. I know a lot of hackers that freak out when they see JSON. It's a certain type of hacker. And so hackers need to take their craft, either white hat or black hat, and develop that craft to focus on understanding how to hack APIs. I think that there's going to be the shift of winds. The winds are changing, and it's going towards APIs because more and more hackers know that we're moving away. Twitter isn't a monolithic application, just like Amazon.com is. It's not one big app running on one big web server. It's a bunch of distributed containers and microservices and APIs, and definitely don't know as much about that as Rinky does, but I'm sure it's a lot more than just one web server. And so hackers know that. So they're going to go after and understand how to hack APIs because that's where the data is.
So the task here, of course, is to be in front of that tension between the hacking and the security. It's always going to be a bit of a back and forth, the spy versus spy, if you will. What do organizations need to do to find out whether they're behind that eight ball? Is this still a case where people don't know how vulnerable they are? Rinky, how do you start the process for understanding your API posture and putting in place the means to stay ahead of those bigger risks?
Yeah, I think if you're kicking off and this is not number one priority for you, at least making the case for it being one of the top priorities is start with identifying what your API environment looks like. What do you have that's currently being used? What older versions that are not used that are still around that may be creating risk? Are there shadow APIs? I think finding that what does your environment look like is the first step. And then going through those to say, how do they work? What do they do for you? What are the high risk ones that you want to go and take a look at? And starting to say, we need a program around this. But identification is, I think, the first step, and then going and then building a program around this. And it may also identifying what teams do you need on board, because as you're identifying what's already existing, if there's things you need to do to change or around how developers are working with APIs, that's another step that you'll want to take a look at. So it's really building that cohesive program around how do you build a culture around this? How do you identify what's out there? How do you change how work is being done so that it's more secure?
And Dana, I'll expound on that. So I think as a CISO, I know I'm really quick to go out there and buy the coolest new thing, shiny new toy. Like, oh my God, I need to buy this. I need to have it. But I think what my recommendation is that CISOs is that we as security leaders and decision makers need to take a step back and go back to the old fine art of defining our requirements first. Creating a functional requirements document on what it is we need from that API threat management solution before we go out there shopping. Know what we need versus buying something and looking at a vendor and saying, oh, you've got that. Oh, yeah, that could be good. I could use that. Oh, you've got that feature. Oh, I could use that. Understand what your requirements are. Most importantly, not just understanding that, but making sure that the most minimum base requirements are, like Rinky said, you can't protect what you don't know you have. So does it have the ability to catalog APIs and find out what your attack surface really is versus what you think it is? What kind of data are those APIs serving? Maybe we don't need to focus on protecting every single API, but I sure as hell want to know which APIs have PII, are serving PHI, PCI, all of those things that are serving regulated data. So where do I need to focus my attention out of the 6,000 API endpoints I have? What are the ones I need to care about the most? Because I know I can't protect my entire operating area, but maybe I can just focus on the ones I need to care about most. And then the other stuff will come in there. Authorization-based attacks. I would say that the number one vulnerability, if you look at the Hubris white paper, if you look at that, you can see the number one vulnerability that's systemic across all APIs is authorization vulnerabilities. Developers are authenticating the request, but not authorizing them. And I don't believe that yes, the API threat management solution should be able to detect that and prevent it. But what about going back to the developers and saying, fix this? It's not just like, let's not just put all of the onus and responsibility on the security control. Let's go to the developers and say, here, our API threat management solution is blocking this stuff because it's exploitable and it works. You need to write better code. And this is how. And so, I think it's an all hands on deck. It's an everyone issue.
Now, because the use of APIs has exploded, because we have even what we call the API economy, it seems to me that this ability to know your API posture, because there's no one throat to choke in an organization of who owns or manages the APIs across your lifecycle, if you start on that path, it's the gift that keeps giving. That not only do you start to mitigate your security and risk, but you're going to get a better sense of how you're digitally operating and where in the process of rolling out digital services you can improve. So do you agree, Rinky, that even though security is the low-lying fruit and the initial important reason to get a better understanding of your APIs, that once you do that, you can do many other very important and beneficial things.
Absolutely. And I always say that if you're thinking about security upfront in any, not just APIs, but any aspect of a product, even, you're going to think about innovative ways to solve for the consumer around security and privacy features, giving you a competitive advantage. And you see this time in and time again where products are released, they have issues that wouldn't have been fixed by any kind of tool or kind of development practices, but had security or privacy been involved, they may have been able to threat model and say, hey, you might want to think about these things as an outcome of the consumer experience where they may feel like this is violating my security or privacy, things that they may have in mind and expect from the product. And so the earlier you have security and privacy involved, the better you're going to be in having those outcomes for the consumer.
And Dana, I really consider that, just having worked as a CISO now, that our role, fundamental to our role, is being a human LinkedIn. Like Sethi, like forming that partnership and relationship with your CTO, having that partnership with infrastructure and operations. APIs are kind of like this weird kind of middle ground between the CISO's office and the CTO's office, because it's infrastructure and operations and also security. And that's probably not too different from other assets in the environment. But, that's one thing I'm navigating, is the fact that, INO thinks they own everything with APIs, but, it is this sort of shared responsibility model. And I think one of the first things that I learned in being a CISO was, wow, I'm in the business of relationships. I'm in the business of forming a relationship with my chief fraud officer, my chief technology officer, my chief human resources officer. Like, all of these things are all relationship building in order to weave security into the culture of the enterprise. It's not an IT problem. And I think in 2021, we all know that by now.
So APIs have become the glue, the currency, a common thread across digital services. But what I just heard was that the CISO is the common denominator and thread among the different silos and cultures that will ultimately be able to impact how well you do and how well you protect your APIs. So CISOs should really start getting very much more acquainted with APIs, risks, and maturity. Any thoughts on why CISOs may not be there yet, Rinky?
I wouldn't say that they aren't. I think that any CISO today is exposed to this. And when you look at, again, the proof is around, look at how many vendors are out there solving for API security now, right? There's hundreds, and they're all doing well. And it's because CISOs have defined that there's a problem that we need to go and solve for. And like I mentioned at the very beginning, it's multi-layered. And that's why there's so much innovation happening right now as we speak in this space. It's not just solving for your typical issues in your infrastructure, but also how are you looking at content validation? How are you looking at those business logic flaws? How are you looking at monitoring? Even how are you looking at identifying APIs? Like, you don't know what you don't know, but how do you start going and finding out what's in your environment? So there's so much innovation happening. And I think all CISOs are talking about this, thinking about this, and it is a challenge and I think CISOs are the common denominator. And how do you bring these different teams together to prioritize this?
I think you hit the nail on the head, Dana. CISOs are the connective tissue and an organization, board of directors, because we have a seat at the big kids table now, CEO, these different departments in the company. And so we're definitely that glue. And I think as it comes to this, I don't think any of the API security solutions are all created equal. I just recently had the pleasure of being invited by Gardner to present to all their analysts on the state of the API security market. And all of these API security vendors have a different approach to API security. And none of them are wrong. They're all great approaches. Some are passive, some are inline, some import the Swagger file and compare the backend API to your open API specification. Some are proxies, all of these different approaches. And it's because the attack surface for APIs is so big. And there's so many things that you need to think about. And there's so many ways to do it. Yeah, I agree. I don't think they are created equal. There's a lot of vendors out there. There's a lot of options, which is why you need to first figure out what you require. What is the backend language? What are you programming in? Does your solution shim into the application? If so, you need to make sure the API security solution supports that language, that sort of thing. All of these are things you need to think through as a decision maker. I just feel like we as CISOs sometimes go out there and look at product options and take the features of the product as our requirements. We need to first look at our requirements and then go shopping.
Well, very good. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. You've been listening and watching a sponsored Briefings Direct discussion on making the most of APIs by better knowing and manage them across their full life cycles. And that includes all the nooks and crannies of your organization. And we've learned how business-critical API users like Twitter are bringing greater maturity to their API's methods and protections and looking at the CISO as the connective tissue across many different parts of the organization, all of whom need to start getting much more aware of these risks. So a big thank you to our guests. We've been here with Alyssa Knight, recovering hacker and partner at Knight Incorporated. Thank you so much, Alyssa.
Thank you.
And we've also been joined by Rinki Sethi, Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer at Twitter. Thank you, Rinki.
It was great being here. Thank you.
And lastly, a big thank you to our audience for joining this Briefings Direct API resiliency discussion. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host throughout the series of traceable AI-sponsored Briefings Direct interviews. Thanks again for listening. Please pass this along to your business community and do come back next time.